Welcome to the Zoë Routh Leadership Podcast, where we explore the future and what this means for your leadership. We ask the big questions. What's happening on the horizon? What does this mean for us? And most importantly, what skills do I need now for leadership of the future? It's time to explore. Let's go.
Hey there, it's Zoe, and welcome to 2023. How exciting. I am super pumped for this year. And we're starting off with a very special edition. It's an interview of me by Tim Collins on his podcast, Better World Leaders. And I've known Tim for a couple of years, and we've interviewed each other on each other's podcast before. And it's a special privilege to be on his show again. We both share similar attitudes and value set. We both believe in human-centered leadership. We both believe in business as being a power for good. And we both believe that leadership is instrumental for helping build better businesses, better organizations, and therefore a better humane planet for us all to live on. So Tim Collins focuses primarily on environment, social, and governance in his work. And he is a very thoughtful, reflective practitioner. So it was a really fun, big conversation that we had. I do hope you enjoy it. Now, the other really cool thing is that this episode kicks us off with our brand new intro and outro and new music. I do hope you enjoy all of it. See you soon.
Zoë Routh, welcome back to the Better World Leaders podcast.
Tim, I am so delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
So for anyone who may not, and I appreciate there probably are a couple of people out there in the world who are not familiar with your work and not familiar with your work and haven't already listened to the first conversation that we had here, or in fact, the conversation we had on your podcast, could you please introduce yourself and share some sense of who you are with whomever is listening?
I'd be delighted to. Thank you so much. I'm Zoë Routh. I'm your friendly neighborhood Canadian-Australian leadership futurist. I work with leaders and teams as we look to the future horizons and work out how to navigate those together.
Wow. That's very concise.
I've been working
and
on
very
it.
and very expansive. I'm like, oh wow, leadership futurist, right? Okay, lots to unpack. And an author amongst all those, or maybe it's one of the ways in which you engage with the content. And yeah, I very much enjoyed reading your last book, which we talked about when you were last here. And now there's a very different gift squeezed in between two covers, which I would love, and we are going to spend some time talking about today. So I'm holding this up just because I like to do this with books when people are on camera. The Olympus Project. Can you just give some sort of high level, sort of fly through of the premise of the book?
Absolutely. Well, it's my fifth book and my first novel. So it's a near future science fiction dystopian book. And the setting is, it's sort of climate change has ravaged the earth. There have been major floods and tsunamis. And in Australia in particular, that has meant Sydney and other seaside towns have all just been drowned out. And that has given rise to a whole new industry of world design, meaning that together we've had to work out how we're going to live and work and feed ourselves in this new environment. That's the setting. The story is about the best and the brightest, and how are they going to survive the earth, survive corporate shenanigans and subterfuge, and each other. It's about the race to build the first community on the moon, which is very exciting. So it's about the call out, the recruitment, the selection, and then the recruitment of these world designers. And then they need to build a prototype and live in it for a year as proof of concept. And then they get to tender their proof of concept for the bid to build on the moon. And lots of stuff happens in between.
Yeah, lots of stuff happens in between. Yeah, so I'm curious on a number of levels. First of all, I'm always curious about authors who manage to sort of walk and work in both worlds of fiction and nonfiction. Mm-hmm. And Hugh Mackay, who we spoke to here, fellow Canberran, he does this magnificently. so yeah, this is just a whole fascinating, sort of side of you, which I'm delighted to have an opportunity to explore. And I'm going to confess, like I'm going to be sitting here with sort of curiosity about my own experience here, because there's like levels of intrigue and discomfort with this topic, right? Like on the one hand, I am very much conscious and have experienced a lot of the things that you're talking about, and yet remain optimistic that we don't as yet have a kind of commitment to a dystopian future. And yet I think these kind of explorations into the very possible futures that are not green and sunny, and haven't we done well and magnificently turned the proverbial boat very, very, very quickly. So yeah, I'll have my own kind of internal juggling to manage as we're talking, and I'm really, really curious about, awkward segue coming up, the design of the book and the frameworks that you've woven through this fictional journey. Sort of knowing. Well, I would say knowing. I think that's not presumptuous anymore. We've spoken a lot over the last few years, but sort of understanding where you've come from to get to this point of framing kind of a learning lesson for leaders in a work of dystopian fiction. Mm-hmm. I'm very, very, very curious about sort of what is sort of implicit in this writing and how you've sort of framed everything together. So,
okay.
Could you reveal some of the sort of learning logic that you've woven through this journey?
I'd be delighted to. So let me first respond to dystopia, utopia. What's that all about? Because why does anybody want to read about a despairing future? And do we really want to reinforce and make it a self-fulfilling prophecy that we're all doomed? And I think it's a useful question. It's like, really? Is it really going to be that bad? And the reason why it feels like a dystopian in reading it is because climate change has accelerated the devastating impact on the Earth. And the reason I chose that particular future is, as a leadership futurist, I look at potential scenarios that may play out, and I kind of ask the question, like, what if we can't roll it back? What does that look like? And just explored that a little bit as a setting piece. It wasn't sort of the main gist of what I wanted to do in the book, though my editor, when I asked him, like, what category do you think this story fits in, he said climate fiction. I'm like, is that even a thing? I didn't even know it was a thing. So there's a whole subsection of science fiction, which is climate fiction, which looks at future worlds where climate has gone a bit wonky. So that's sort of where that arose. And the other aspect of using a dystopian to set a story is that it creates another adversary for the protagonist to have to deal with. So it creates another element of conflict. So from a story narrative point of view, it's helpful. From a design of the book, from a leadership thinking perspective, the genesis of this book came about in 2020 when I was doing a writing course with Stephen Kotler called Flow for Writers. And I was doing that course to help me write People Stuff, which was my last leadership book, which I published in 2020 and won very happily Business Book of the Year. And when I did that course, I fell in love with language again. And then there was a secondary question that kept bubbling away for me as I was reading more and studying language in works of fiction as well as nonfiction. And it was, how might a fiction story have impact? How do fiction stories have impact? And I was reading Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea series at the time, which was lyrical, powerful, evocative, and it just kind of slid through my brain and landed in my heart, as Maya Angelou says about how words can do this for you. And I thought, wow, what a brilliant thing. And I thought, could I write a novel that does something similar and weave into it leadership concepts, ideas, and challenges in there? So that was the premise and the idea and the challenge I set for myself. So to the second part of your question about what are the leadership frameworks and questions that I have hopefully woven in there, there was a number of questions I started with, and it was largely wanting to wrestle with the idea of power. how does power show up? How do we use power? How do we abuse power? Are we able to handle it when we think that we have mastered ourselves and maybe we haven't? So there's the idea of how do different people and different stages of leadership maturity handle power. And that speaks to the second framework, or actually the core framework that I explore through this in a non-stated way, which is actually, no, there is part where we do look at leadership maturity, and it is stated by a couple of different characters. And leadership maturity framework is a developmental integral theory, which has at its core premise that adults continue to develop should there be a change in circumstance and a need for them to change and shift their perspective. And so I use developmental theory to underpin all of my leadership work, meaning that in the work that I do, I'm helping leaders to understand and see complexity and then be able to operate, navigate, and make decisions within ambiguity, uncertainty, and complexity. So that whole VUCA world is what I work to help my leaders navigate. And in doing so, it expands their sense of inclusion, their circle of concern, and expands their sense of purpose. So I'm intentionally wanting to expand people's points of view and to challenge who they think they are, how they relate to others in the world, and what kind of actions they take in the world, and to really see the ripple effect of what they're doing. So that core integral leadership development theory is woven into the book and forms part of what Gaia Enterprises wants to do. And Gaia Enterprises is the leading organization in the book that is tendering for building this community on the moon. And Maya Garcia is one of the founders, and she has at her core mission to elevate human development through the design of different worlds. So she had, her question was, can we create worlds in which we accelerate human development so that people can do all that expansive thinking about who they are, how they fit in, and how they can navigate complexity? So she merged the design of worlds and communities into this concept, like physical concept of it. And throughout the training of her designers, she talks about what is your leadership maturity? What is your values framework? How is that supporting you? And that's also part of the work that I do with leaders as well. I get them to interrogate, what are your values? How are they shaping your thinking, your being, and your doing? And are they helping or hindering your progress as a leader? So those are a couple of different frameworks and core ideas that weave, sift, drift through the novel for you.
No, that's fantastic. So you've got this kind of operating framework kind of playing out at a number of levels. Not, trying to kind of, do the journalistic, sort of thing and try and kind of draw something out, some kind of juicy goodness that, sort of I can lay claim to having extracted. But I'm curious from a narrative perspective to hear of, kind of an example in the book where maybe a character is at a point of realization that they're in the midst of or have just emerged from a developmental threshold.
Mm-hmm.
So is there, without giving too much away, and really I will of course explicitly invite people, if they haven't already, to read the book when we get to the how do people find out more about you and your work bit at the end. But is there something, without sort of by any means giving too much away, that you could say, hey, here's an example when character X did Y and realized they were at threshold Z? Is there something that's sort of woven within the narrative that you could
Absolutely.
point to?
So
Well, I imagine there's lots, but
as I was looking at each character, I actually had a little sketchbook or notebook where I made notes on each of the characters and thought about where are they in their leadership maturity? What stage are they at? What kind of challenges does that present for them? And how does this get confronted as they go through these different experiences? And one of the characters, Jonas, Jonas Seaborn is his name. And there's a whole story about his name as well, about how he becomes Jonas Seaborn. Yeah. And what happens with him is that he, as an identity, he's trying to distinguish himself apart from his parents, who are world famous world designers, and they're kind of like celebrity world designers. And he's trying to make his own mark. And so he's got this identity thing that he's pushing against. Who am I? How do I prove myself? So there's a little bit of parental distinguishing. So earlier stage of leadership maturity is coming to know self through identity. So he's really in the expert stage of leadership maturity, where he's trying to stand on his own experience and background. And he puts his hat in the ring for the competition. as an engineer, as a mechanic. And so he joins into that whole selection process trying to prove himself. And he stands on his own. He's not very aware of other people's points of view, and he certainly pushes his own agenda. And that falls flat on a number of different occasions. And he starts to have these moments of, I'm not doing this right. I'm really out of my depth. And it's probably through selection, he's sort of getting this feedback. Things aren't quite going his way. People aren't reacting the way that he thought they might. And he gets this dawning sense of self awareness. And then it sort of starts to slam into him quite a lot through the selection process and the interview process, where he's challenged to think about himself and his impact on others. And he's like, uh-oh, I didn't really think about that. Oh my goodness. And so he goes from this being this cocky, self-assured individual to this unsure person, and unsure how he's supposed to go and what he's supposed to do. And his sense of self crumbles a little bit, which is what happens when we go through different stages of leadership maturity. Our sense of truth and self gets challenged, and we have to find a new way of looking and being and seeing. And so he discovers this throughout the process of selection and throughout the novel, about working out what are the things that he needs to do in order to engage better with other humans. So his journey is really much about a self-awareness journey and an appreciation and support of others. So he drops a lot of the arrogance as he goes through the novel. So that's he's one of the core characters. And then the main character, the main narrator, Xanthi Waters, I tagged her as individualist stage. So, and she speaks her values very clearly from the beginning of the book, where she's all about inclusion and community and equality. And she pushes against crash commercialism. And she's trying to resolve all of that. So she has these lots of different big tussles with different value sets. And her husband's got a different value set to her. They kind of grew apart in their value system, where she starts to appreciate and seek out space exploration, and he definitely doesn't want to do that. So she's in, as we meet her in the book, from the beginning, she's in at threshold in her personal world and her professional world, and she's kind of at breaking point, and she kind of boils along. She's like a boiling pot actually, until she has this moment of catharsis later on in the book, where she has to challenge and resolve who she thinks she is, what her values are, and how they're different potentially to other people around her. And how did she navigate that? How does she show up as a leader? And for her, her biggest challenge is, how do I speak up? How do I find my voice? And because she's got all these unresolved challenges, they kind of just erupt from time to time, from time to time in spectacular fashion. And she works out, there's some stuff I haven't resolved. So some of her challenges are about looking at shadow. What are my shadow areas, and where am I burying stuff, and how am I going to heal and handle all that, which is a lot of the work that we have to do as leaders in later stages of leadership maturity, is to become whole and integrated, is to look at that stuff that we carry with us so that it doesn't take over when we least expect. So that's another very different journey than Jonas's journey of self-awareness. Ultimately, both are journeys of self-awareness, just different stages and different situations that prompt their developmental work.
I mean, just hearing you explore those, and thank you for your generosity in that detail. Yeah, I mean, just makes me only want to read. Well, I think fiction is extremely powerful for a number of reasons, but it's so much more alive than all the abstraction that I certainly have spent a lot of time, sort of wrestling with, and then trying to encourage others to wrestle with as well, right? Like even just describing Jonas and Xanthi's journeys, like that sounds to me like so much more enticing and so much worthwhile of time and energy than like trying to sort of draw my way through like a diagrammatic exploration of this same learning framework. Of like, when you're here, this this is what might show up, and that might show up. And it's like, okay, here's a story.
And stories are designed to make us feel something. That's what stories are about. We experience other worlds by reading story, and I think it's a fast track to development, actually, to get a view into somebody else's environment and world, so that we can learn vicariously through each other. If we're going to develop empathy, fiction is one of the best ways to do that, I reckon, is so that we can see through other people's eyes how the world is and feel through the feelings that they're experiencing. And that's absolutely what I wanted to do in this book, is to showcase how messy development is and that there's no easy answers. Some things seem very straightforward. It's wrong to do this and it's right to do that. And the characters have moments where they do explore that. And then it gets shades of gray and multi-layered, and what is the right thing to do. So I wanted readers to really think about how they might handle situations if they were in it. Would they come to the same conclusions? How do they perceive right or wrong? And this story is told from multiple points of view. So there's multiple perspectives in there, which was actually quite hard to juggle. And I was wondering how people would navigate between all of these lenses on the world. And I wanted to give an insight into how people come to justify sometimes their points of view, whether they are right or wrong. They feel that they're right from wherever they're standing, and how that can be quite dangerous for many of us. So, for example, Claire is one of the senior staff at Gaia Enterprises, and she is the COO. So she's the second command to the leadership, and she has aspirations to be CEO. And she discovers along the way that the CEO doesn't really trust her judgment, even after working there for 10 years. And that sort of seeds a whole bunch of frustration and resentment for her. And she starts to question her leader. And all sorts of thoughts start to cloud her or skew her point of view. And what I was hoping the readers would do as they went through this is like, do they see what's happening to Claire? Do they see how that might happen to them as well? Are there places where we have talked ourselves into a way of seeing that makes us feel righteous and maybe makes us feel wronged? And so that is that whole, like, how do the narratives we tell ourselves about what we're experiencing create a very specific view of the world? And I think I'm just fascinated by this too. Like, I hopped on Twitter for today because it's just exploring the weirdness that's on Twitter at the moment. And with the recording of what happened this morning was Trump announced overnight that he feels that the Constitution and other laws should be thrown out because of whatever. And I'm like, wow, this is really interesting. Let's go see what people are saying about that. And of course, there's two completely different universes in the Twitter land. There are those who's like saying Trump is speaking the truth, and those are going, he's outrageous and inciting insurrection again. And I'm like, wow. So how do we create these different truths? Same situation, and then there's completely different lenses on it. And I think this is one of the fundamental challenges we have as leaders today, is how do we actually form our internal narratives? Are we putting enough focus on how we're constructing these truths and these perspectives? Are we challenging that? And a lot of the books I've been reading, these nonfiction books actually, around biases and how those filters are, and how we need to spend a lot of time challenging our thinking, because we don't have an objective source of truth. Did we ever? I'm not sure. And in any case, there's a lot of murkiness around this whole notion of truth that is out there.
Yeah. No, thank you. There's a huge amount in there, and I'm just trying to decide where to invite us to double click. So I think that
nice metaphor.
Thanks. It is, and I recall this happening with last time as well. Like you have a really good way of covering a lot of ground quickly, and then I'm like, I want to go here, and I want to go here, and I want to go here. So I think narrative construct is a whole domain that I would spend weeks and weeks happily wandering around in, especially when it relates to, sort of beliefs and worldviews, and then, sort of influences who, we kind of happily marry up with and kind of co-create these worldviews with, or at least we tell ourselves a story that we're co-creating them with them. So we could definitely talk a bit about narrative constructs and the role of stories creating futures, which there's a fabulous conversation here with Claire Marshall on exactly that topic. And I'd love to sort of hear your lens on that as well, especially since you've chosen to write a story about, as you said, one possible future. Again, sort of like, what was the sort of moment of decision to commit to doing that to help and inform your work? But then the other one is biases, and just how do we bring attention to them, and sort of what do we expect people to do when we do bring attention to them, and just how does that whole development path with bias work? So there's 3: narrative constructs, stories as futures, working with biases. Do any of those entice you?
Wow, they're all pretty juicy. There we go. There's the juicy word again. Let's start with biases, because I think this is probably one of the most important leadership skills that we need to master if we are going to be able to contend with the future. And that whole third person perspective of thinking about our thinking is a leadership skill we don't see very often in leadership development programs, and it's absolutely essential. A very useful book is called Unblinkered, and whose author's name has gone out of my head. It's very frustrating for me. Usually it comes like that. In any case, this book, Unblinkered, was written about the biases that inform our thinking, and she offers practical exercises to counter each of these biases to kind of get us to challenge our thinking. So I think people have been talking about these different types of biases, and there's hundreds and hundreds that we could list. A couple of them that we need to be mindful of is confirmation bias. And this is what I see playing out in Twitter, like, here's another piece of evidence that Trump is right, Trump is wrong, depending on which lens you're putting on it. And so we build our realities based on truth seeking that reinforces our own worldview. And so how do we counter that? We have to ask the questions like, what is somebody else's point of view on this? How would they see this? How might they determine it to be wrong? And to lean into that side of things. And so the idea to handle paradox or ambiguity is a hallmark of somebody who has flexible thinking. So that's an example of one of the ways that we can challenge a bias. And the sunk cost fallacy is another big one that we all get roped into. That's where we've put so much money and time and energy into something we are reluctant to let it go. And so I think that one's been pretty meaningful for me in terms of being able to let things go. It's like, why are you hanging on to this? The money is gone. The time is gone. Is there a future for it? And what does it mean if you explore something different to let go? So that's my first comments around biases. And that's sort of what I wanted to explore a little bit in the novel as well, is to watch that in real time with different people layering up and seeking to confirm their own points of view, and how that sometimes gets shattered with new information if we seek it, and also if we allow it. And there is a cathartic experience between two of the main characters where a new piece of information is tabled, and that whole paradigm of how one thought about the other is crumples, just gone. And it's like, oh, I didn't know. I could have had 10 years of different thinking about you. And I think that often happens. And I've been thinking about how this plays out also. It's such a hard thing, right? Because bias is like we're swimming in water. We just don't know that we're actually in water, like fish in water. They don't know that they're in water until they get taken out of the water. And sometimes that's why dealing with bias is so incredibly difficult, because we're not aware that we're like fish in water until they go wham, they get ripped out of it. And one of the ways I've noticed, I'm curious to see actually your experience this, Tim, where you've had your own thoughts change about something. For me, it's been this one particular topic. It's on Julius Caesar. And for years, I've loved every story about Julius Caesar, like this huge general who was betrayed by the Senate. And I thought, wow, this is a great story of leadership betrayed. And then as I started reading more and thinking more about Julius Caesar and what the senators were actually doing for him or doing to him because of his behavior, I'm like, oh my God, Caesar really was a despot. He was a popular despot. He was angling to become an authoritarian control freak. Well, he basically was. And he did that through populism and binary thinking, which is straight out of the playbook of all the autocrats we see around the world. And it was a nonfiction book that highlighted this for me, actually. Not Julius Caesar, but the whole idea of how autocrats are ruling the world right now, or rising in the world. And that's the book by Moises Naim. His two books, the End of Power and the Revenge of Power, have been really helpful for me to help me examine how I've been thinking about powerful leaders. And then I changed my whole opinion on Caesar and what the senators did. They were trying to stop autocracy. Now, I mean, they had lots of things that weren't going great in terms of what they were doing for Roman citizens, etc. There was plenty to reform, but that was sort of the gist of it. And I saw them in a completely different light. So that was kind of like, wow, okay. That's how I've had my mind turned about. And that was through, it was sort of challenging a bias, I guess. And if I'm not sure what exactly bias that was, maybe confirmation bias. Great leaders are blah. And here's an example of a great leader, well admired, well loved. There's statues all around Rome to Caesar. And he was an a-hole in some ways. And then in some ways, not at all. Because in his fortune, when he died, in his will, he left 400 denarii to each Roman citizen. I think it was 400. It was an enormous amount of money at the time. A huge largesse. Like, how could you hate Caesar when he was so good to the people, so beloved of the people? I'm like, wow, we see this a lot in other political discourses that are happening right now. So I'm curious to throw a question back at you, Tim, is when have you experienced that sort of, oh, I'm a fish in water kind of moment where you've all of a sudden had a flashlight shone on a bias and you've seen something differently?
Many times. I'm just trying to think of a kind of a suitable example. So I'm going to respond first of all by just kind of anchoring back to story, and then also noting that power is sort of an instrumental fulcrum through this book and therefore your work, and we should explore that if we can squeeze it in as well. Just a little conversation about power and authority and structures and so on. So I think in the last, let's just say 3 years, I think story has become like the modality for shifting in me and my work, and actually non-fiction story, but appreciating that to hold a space for a deeply kind of profound personal transformation to emerge through someone's own self-narration, like is a very kind of tender thing, and you need to hold that very gently and not in any way kind of force someone into that liminality. But I've done a lot of narrative work, and not speaking to anyone else's experience, just speaking to mine, sort of retelling and re-exploring the story of a pairing of experiences that I have had has been really, really interesting to note the affect that storytelling has on me, to note that affect that it has on audiences, sort of active, sort of engaged and witnessing, has been a really interesting journey in discovery, especially about what is needed for me to witness my own lived narrative and then act based on like the story I tell of my life in alignment with my values, which again is like the crux of so much of your work. And really realizing that I hadn't been doing that, certainly to the extent that I believed I was, and I was actually leaving a lot of stuff on the table, to use an awkward metaphor, from a story perspective, and the sort of the pale, shadowy versions of ourselves that we show to the world because we either haven't witnessed our own, stories enough, or we haven't, sort of become, sort of effective enough at telling them to ourselves and then to others. And yeah, I've been storytelling of my own lived experience in a very different way in the last few years, and it's led to very different experiences for me and of me. So I can be more specific, but I wonder if that might be enough.
That's a really cool awareness. I am desperate to know. Give me an example. But I put you on the spot, and it's your podcast, so I'm not sure that that's appropriate.
And you have one, and you're very good at this. No, come on. We're like, I think we're friendly enough that we can play with this. Well, I mean, just in a concise form, for listeners may be already very familiar with this, but I had this PTSD experience on the roof of my house in the path of a bushfire during the Black Summers, and that in of itself, was a thing. And what it specifically did was connect me to a suppressed traumatic experience of witnessing a flood destroy a village and kill lots of people in front of me in my early 20s. Wow. And I had completely suppressed that experience and sort of denied myself access to it as a fundamental part of my lived experience. So it was the experience on the roof that sort of unlocked access to that, which is quite often how PTSD works. And then the storytelling part of it, like, first of all, it was a story being told about what had happened to me. And it then became a story of kind of what I was witnessing and what was happening sort of through me. And, the sort of relativity to climate change and climate impact, and, the reality that climate change is not a thing many generations away, that we need to be all sort of there. What a shame we've messed the world up for our grandkids. It's like, no. It's been happening for decades, and it's very much here now. And for me, it was a calling to orientate work towards that space. And then the story should have shifted twice more, like, sort of what it has meant about what is happening as me, as a member of a community, from a human and ecological perspective. And then now it's kind of become much more kind of collective and connecting to a lot of shared narrative that is then being told collaboratively in a way to sort of bring new ways of organizing and new kind of motivations for doing and being different in our worlds, because, like, this is increasingly a shared story of shared lived experience, and yet the stories of the futures haven't shifted that much, and there's a lot of binarism. It's kind of like, well, you drive an EV or you drive a regular car, right? And I feel like we need a lot more creativity in the stories that we tell about our shared futures in order to access the pathways and create the reality to bring those futures into being.
Very powerful example. And sad that, scary, I don't know, how that experience unleashed a repressed memory. God, that must have been really scary for you. And I think what a wonderful insight to say, how are we co-creating, how are we collaborating on the story of what we're experiencing, and what it means. I think that's a really interesting thing. And we're constantly doing that as humans. We can't help but doing it. We are meaning-making creatures. Everything from somebody shows up on your doorstep, what are they wearing? What story is that? And we just have this associative machine, which is our brain, go to town on that and create a story and pop it out. And it's only until, as we start to challenge those stories and say, is it valid? Is it truthful? Is it useful? That we can actually start to do something proactive and intentional with it. Are we happy with the binary story of you drive an EV or you don't, and what that means for our specific choices? Or is there some other third way of looking at things? I think the third way is an important aspect of this to help us get through the binary stuff. I'm writing the prequel to the novel, and it's called Terra Blanca, which is a failed community experiment, and I'm writing how it failed. And I'm hoping to seed questions and challenges in there, because there's very much a binary problem in there that doesn't get resolved properly because no one could look at the third way. And I think if we challenge ourselves to, I think this is a good takeaway for people listening. If we find we're left with an either or choice, ask the question, what if there was a third option? What if there was an and option? What does that look like? And there's probably no obvious answer at that immediately. And yet, if we keep leaning into that, it helps us from reducing it, reducing into that sort of black and white worldview, which is unhelpful because it pits us against each other instead of pushing us toward each other. And I think that kind of work is really, really important. I like how you say that we need to create stories together about the kind of future that we want, and to be intentional about that. I agree with that. I think it's really important leadership work that we do that.
Yeah. Thank you. And it is. And I kind of see it starting to happen. I think it's a recognition that, as leaders, it's tricky right now, and there's much more that is unknown than is known. And again, the extent to which that's never not been the case, right? But I think go back over certainly as long as I've been alive, let's just say 42 years, because that's what it is. Right? I think there's definitely been a perception in a lot of people, particularly people leading in businesses and large kind of institutions, that you knew more or less what was going to happen within kind of a few degrees of variance. And we've seen that with centrism in politics, where governments change but policies don't really vary very much, with market economics being reasonably kind of certain, like you can have this big incline, you can have a crash, and a big incline, you're going to crash. And now all of a sudden we've got this poly ambiguity rolling in, where it's just like, for so many reasons, there's now more change than most people can cope with. And I think in my experience, that's come down to people being trained to be good at complicated and essentially learn how not to deal with complexity. Right? Like creativity as a way of thinking was kind of reserved for this certain kind of category of people who are over there doing creative stuff. Right? But creativity as a process, as a way of thinking, as a way of engaging with the world and showing up in the world, kind of being okay with not really knowing where the day was going to finish or what the output of your toils would be. I haven't seen much of that in the mainstream business leadership stuff for ever in my lived experience until about 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's sort of like, oh, let's be creative thinkers now. And it's, oh, if you want to be innovative, then you do creativity. And if you're not in the innovation department, then you don't need to bother, really. And I think it's good that people start to play with these paradigms and these processes to be creative, because we have no choice, really. Our future depends on us thinking differently, conceiving differently, seeing differently, and to explore something that hasn't been seen before. And how do we do that? Well, we explore the past and explore the narratives that we have laid over the past, and see if we can see those differently and see patterns and extrapolate from there, which is the work of futurism, really. So as a leadership futurist, I advocate, first of all, looking far into the past so we can see the patterns that have merged to today, and looking far into the future to see what possible futures are there and what possible futures we might create. I think that's a really important part of it. And the next one is to go deep and to move past the surface issues and to explore the systemic patterns that are underneath what is presenting to us, and so that we can keep asking questions, unpack and unpick those biases to see what has been constructed here, what is within the root value system that is creating all of this. And it's something I've been obsessing with lately about that, this whole discourse that is the water in which we are swimming around growth is our mantra for businesses, for everything. how are we growing? How are we growing? How are we growing? And we have failed to see that sometimes the growth trajectory of business has meant the exploitation of the planet and of people. And we can't continue to go forward with that. So that's an example of like, wow, I never really thought to challenge the whole idea of growth until I read Kate Rayworth's book, The Donut of Economics, which says this is a paradigm that's no longer working. I'm like, oh my God, here's my fish in water moment, another one. And to then jump into a different pond where you're different water, where growth is not the paradigm, where it's more about human flourishing within planetary resources, sensible use of planetary resources is a different pond to swim in. And it's refreshing, I tell you. That water over there is quite sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I think the whole growth debate, because that's again what it is at the moment. It's very binary. It's either we need to grow constantly or we don't. Um, yeah, I see this being a kind of a fundamental vortex of, kind of deficit of good storytelling, because like growth is so necessary and so needed and so myopic in how we look at it at the moment, right? Like if nature grew the way capitalism teaches us to grow, there'd be no sun in the sky because the trees would all be up to the stratosphere and we'd have a canopy all the way around us. And, like growth is good and needed and necessary, but in an ecological way where you grow something, it has its role, and then it stops growing and it kind of matures and hosts others and does that for the longest part of its life cycle, and then it declines and then it goes into a kind of a really deep nourishing phase of decay where its only job then is to nourish others. And like we just seem to have this I feel like it's almost like a mortal imperative to ignore that bit, like that nourishing, essentially in death bit. And yeah, we just want to kind of preserve and everything to prevail and continue to grow, which is impossible on any number of levels. But I feel like there's this missing part of the story of degrowth, or whatever the lens is, where it's kind of really, to me, it feels like it's lots of respect to Jason Hickel and all those that are kind of out there doing this interesting, complicated work, but I feel like again the storytelling is missing a point at the moment, that like growth is really, really important and we need it, but it needs to be a different kind of growth to what we've been told is the story of growth only over the last couple of 100 years. But it's an important couple of 100 years because it's the only stories that most people are aware of.
I like that observation around the cycles of growth. And I'm glad you went there because that's immediately what leapt to my mind, is that there are cycles. There are cycles in nature and seasons, etc. And the whole growth model, if we think about it from a visual point of view, is this, I think of a XY chart with the line going up and cutting diagonally, sort of growth trajectory. That's how we display growth and its importance. And we don't like to think about falling off that scale because we have linked stories around that to failure to innovate, etc. And if we plotted growth as a cycle instead, that would be far more useful for all of us. It's like, what phase of the growth cycle are we in, which is germination, flourishing, uh, decay, rebirth. And that's the natural rhythms of which we all have emerged and will return to. If we looked at our businesses that way, that would be really interesting. And it creates a whole new construct of how we conduct ourselves and how we see ourselves and how we see the purpose of our business. I think that's lovely.
Yeah. 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 I think it's much needed, and a brilliant framework that I'll quickly introduce just by name here. And we had a conversation with Giles Hutchins where this was touched on, and you see it in Daniel Christian Wall's work a lot, as well as the Panarchy framework, which is like the Helios loop. And it names those points in the growth cycle, right? Only 4 of them. But it essentially states that kind of decline, decay is a must-have like kind of, and therefore needs to be designed for phase. And that, in these imaginary constructs that we have called corporations, right? Like they actually don't have to die because they're imaginary, but they need to follow this cycle. Otherwise it leads to lots of other things. And so if we looked at power, I'm just desperate to get back to this. I'm very conscious of our time. If we looked at power and how power pervades systems that don't follow these cycles, and how power exists in examples where these cycles do exist, right? Like you think about the power that resonates out of an enormous coral reef, or a giant sequoia or something like that. Like these are powerful examples of growth in nature. I just like the whole way that we've kind of structured power. Just again, it seems it's a system doing a really good job of kind of re-enshrining itself, but not actually kind of.
The thing that jumps to mind in terms of that, if we look at human power, like power between humans, that where it's working well, where you're going through cycles, is where people, organization, teams have a really healthy relationship to succession planning, and really have embraced that. Where is the pinnacle of decay and rebirth happening with this, in terms of encouraging others through the system, as opposed to clinging to our own existence and our own meaning making and our own status. And I think that's an example of where we could move more into that rhythm of successful power brokering. I don't know what's at the moment, what I'm seeing with leaders, what stops them from doing that is a sense of scarcity.
Yeah.
And it's a scarcity mindset where I don't have enough people, I don't have enough time, I don't have the energy to invest in others. And that sort of sense of not enough is creating that energy pattern where they don't do the succession planning. Is it a real constraint or an imagined one? I'm not sure exactly, because I know it feels really real to those leaders. They really feel they don't have enough people, they don't have enough time. And it's the paradox, right? Because if you don't make the time, if you don't create it as a priority, then you miss out on that cycle. You will end up falling off your perch, extending your leadership in a way that isn't helpful to the organization, and it'll be forced into a decay that's not monitored and managed well. And then you have cultural implosions, toxic cultures, and leaders that get pushed out as opposed to leaving on healthy terms. So, do you have the time not to do this work? I don't think so.
Yeah, absolutely. And what that really spoke to me was about the power of the growth paradigm, right? Like you don't feel that you have the time, effort, energy, resources, funding to do. What is it that you're trying to do? Like, what is this relativity of scarcity about, which is very real when you're in it? It's like, oh, it's because we're trying to hit some abstract, distant, mandated growth target that doesn't pay attention and certainly will never be in deference to the conditions and the reality on the ground, right? Like we all know when we see our solar panels generating power or not, what's possible dependent on the conditions, right? Like there's plenty of examples in most ecologies where there's abundant growth when there's specific conditions, and then there's growth but slower growth or different growth or growth in different areas when there's conditions that are less perfect for growth. And then when the conditions are not conducive to growth, there is not any growth, right? But we don't accept that.
Well, it makes us feel powerless to consider that, right? So how do I control conditions? Well, sometimes you can't.
Yeah.
And I don't think people like feeling that constrained.
Yeah. And yet we don't recognize the power sort of the reality as in the real world, what's actually happening outside, not all the less real stuff, and the power that we have to sort of operate in a really sort of fundamental, contributing, collaborative role within that, and that our absence depletes the power of that system overall. So it's like everybody has a role, system's really powerful, but sort of don't distort the power in the system for some abstract goal that's essentially becoming harmful.
I think that's a really important observation. And I would add to it how important adaptability is as a leadership skill. So we've had creativity as listed as one of our mainstays, as well as looking third-person perspective at our thinking. And I think one of the third most important skills is adapting, as opposed to resilience. And I think this is a really important distinction, because the last couple of years we've been focused on how do we get people more resilient, so they can just cope with what's coming their way. And I think that's sort of a baseline thing. It's like, let's develop the emotional fortitude for people to contend with this. Adaptability is to know that they have that within it. They can exercise that emotional cadence and resourcefulness, and be able to look constructively, creatively to the future and create new ways of being and doing that are handling the challenges that are being thrust upon us, or being co-created by us and being thrust upon us. I guess it's sort of this, and this is how we might adapt to it. So it's an interesting thing to explore, actually, is as leaders, are we contributing to the system? Are we making it worse? Can we create a new system? And what does that look like? And what do we need to do in order to adapt to these new ways of seeing, being, and doing? I think that's a very different conversation to leadership than how do we keep growing?
Oh, that's a conversation I want to have and keep having. And I feel like that is actually in what you did, kind of the two parts of what you just said, I think is both beautiful summation and very eloquent provocation. So perhaps that might be a nice point to just sort of start to sort of edge away from this very, very enjoyable and active dialogue today. So two final invitations, if I may. One, is there anything else that you would like to add, provoke, prompt to sort of bring a sense of completeness for you to this dialogue? And then where can people come and connect with you and find out more about you and your wonderful work?
Thanks, Tim. I felt it was a good place to, I felt like it was just ripening to the right place in the conversation. Last things to say is to invite people to be humble, curious, and compassionate. Those are the three hallmarks of an elder. And I think if we embraced elderdom, then it would help us lead better. So in that, to read things widely, listen widely, allow your thinking to be challenged, allow yourself to be a fish flung out of the water so you can see and experience life outside of the water. I think that's probably a useful thing for people to go and play with a little bit. The second thing is, how can people find me? My website is zoerouth.com, ZOEROUTH.com. And I'm very active on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. And my book, The Olympus Project, you can find on Amazon, and you can get the ebook there. It's in Kindle Unlimited. So if you're in Kindle Unlimited, you can get it there for free. Otherwise, it's available as an ebook, and also a print book from Amazon, other bookstores, as well as on my own site if you want a personally signed copy.
Beautiful. I can recommend a personally signed copy. I have personally signed copies of both Zoe's most recent books. So there you go. Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much. Fabulous conversation. Again, I sense not, the last time that we're going to converse this way either. So yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. It's been a joy. It's been a pleasure and a joy. Well, that was a really fun interview to be part of. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. I hope you have picked up a copy of The Olympus Project, and you can play along with imagining the future and what it means for leadership. That is the focus of my work this year and into the future. And I do hope that you can get a lot of traction with it as we work our way through the podcast and all the glorious opportunities that are ahead of us. In the meantime, live well, lead well.
You've been listening to the Zoë Routh Leadership Podcast. To find out more about leadership of the future or to contact Zoë, go to zoerouth.com.